Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the final session of the day. I hope you've all had a fantastic conference for the last 2 days. My name's Lisa Johnson, and I'm going to be the chair for today. We've got a fabulous panel that are going to be discussing DEIB and what our role is within L&D. So rather than me introduce the panel to you, I'm going to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves. And we're going to start with Sandra. And Sandra, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your organisation, and how you became a passionate advocate of DEIB.
I can indeed. Hello, everyone. I'm Sandra Arnold, pronouns she, her. I would describe myself as a midlife woman, and I am also severely deaf, and I have been severely deaf for the last 20 years. My deafness is a mixed hearing loss, so I have conductive hearing loss and sensorineural, which means I've got amazing hearing aids, which make the volume louder. What hearing I have got left, it makes it, it improves it, but it doesn't mean I don't hear the same as you do, a hearing person would. And the sensorineural is about the sounds. So the sort of vowel sounds I can hear quite well, but the consonant sounds I don't hear so well. So I may not hear the clarity of the voice. So that's kind of where my passion for inclusion comes from for myself. But that's kind of how I describe myself. It wouldn't say it defines me. I am also a regional head of learning for UK and EMEA at Group M. Group M are a global media investment company, and about, I expect you've heard of Group M being at Amazon, and about $60 billion of media investment come through our agencies, Essence Mediacom, Wavemaker, Mindshare, and M6. So to kind of put that in perspective, for you, 1 in every 3 ads that you might see anywhere is placed by a Group M agency, basically. So quite large. And yeah, my role spans everything to do with the learning from UK and EMEA. I'm passionate about DEI for obvious reasons, from my hearing perspective, but it kind of really came to the fore more when I was working at Group M and with the amazing team that I worked with. It's only really in the last, I'd say 5 years or so, that I've actually been quite open about my hearing loss. I've always tried to hide it, or just get through and not actually do anything, and just manage and cope and cover and that sort of thing. But the team I work with are absolutely amazing, and they really encourage, and they talk about their own difficulties, their own differences and things like that, and it's really encouraged me to talk more about that. But I'm equally sort of passionate about, particularly working in media, about ageism as well, because in media the average age is about 30. And there's a huge drop-off in our industry post 45, 50, particularly with women. So I'm very passionate about trying to find out why and doing more about that and getting more midlife women back into media. And that's me.
Great. Thanks, Sandra. Heather, same question for you.
Thank you. So I'm Heather Gilmartin-Adams. I'm a senior analyst with Red Thread Research. Red Thread is a human capital research and advisory firm that focuses on topics like diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, learning and performance, learning and skills, career, people analytics, that kind of thing. So we do a lot of reading, interviewing people, and publishing on those topics. My background, and this kind of leads into why I'm passionate about DEIB, is I was trained in international peace building and conflict resolution. Before that, I actually studied history, and so I have sort of an abiding interest in why do humans other humans? Like, why do we have this? Why do we other so much? Why do we focus on the differences between us and allow those differences to blossom into all kinds of harmful things? And so I've always had a strong interest in understanding how can I help people see the humanity in the other across those divides, and help people work more effectively together. And so that's sort of that's the broad framing for my interest in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which I'm currently doing a bunch of research on. And this is actually the first time that I've researched DEIB and learning, and thinking really about learning equity and what it means for people to have unequal access to development opportunities and the follow-on consequences of those inequalities. That's something that I've been learning a lot about very recently, and have become really passionate about making that access more equal, both within formal education systems and within organizations.
Great, thanks Heather. And Nathan.
Thanks. So my name's Nathan Jordan. I'm global leader of training and enablement at Amazon Web Services in our startup segment. AWS is Amazon's cloud technology arm, and we basically power the world. Everything that you use, from your phone to Netflix to Uber to everything else you've never even thought about, runs through an AWS system. My role at AWS is, as it sounds, I look after training within our startups organization, and so that is, any company that is just starting out in life all the way up to small to medium enterprises, and we support them through a whole range of technology solutions. My role is kind of twofold, so we look at training, and then the enablement side of things is really how we support people internally to do their best work. I'm really passionate about inclusion, diversity, and belonging, and so I make sure that that's embedded in all that we do as a team. Amazon is unique-ish in a sense that we have D&I teams that set goals and measure targets, but they don't actually do the delivery of, helping us meet those targets. That's on us as leaders. And so I take that responsibility really seriously within my team. I advocate for that with the work that I do internally, but I also do a lot of D&I work externally. So I've got a side business called This is Black Gen Z, and I'm really standing up the first ever data source of Black Generation Z people within the UK. So currently no data exists around what motivates Black Gen Z to apply to certain jobs over others, what motivates them to go to companies over others, and also what makes them stay, and and how to engage and attract them. And so I've interviewed thousands of Black Gen Z talent to try and understand this, and I'm putting together a kind of full report which gives companies insights into things that they can do to improve their own practices internally, but also help win the war for talent. I've also written an ebook, actually, which I'll share with you after this. I'll put a QR code on the top. But if you want to find out more about the project, thisisblackgenz.com, everything's on there. And yeah, I've worked in D&I for quite a number of years. I was at Dyson prior to Amazon, where I really wrote the first kind of paper on D&I at Dyson, and subsequently they've hired a D&I director who's really working to move that. And prior to that, I was also at Walgreens Boots Alliance, again, setting up an LGBT resource group for the first time. So I've been doing this for quite a number of years, and something I'm very passionate about.
Excellent. So you see you've got an amazing panel here with us today. I'm just going to walk across and turn the slide off to help them with the brightness that's blinding them a little bit. So I meant to do that before I walked back before. So we're allowed to make a few mistakes. So we're going to start off just by trying to get everybody on the same page around DEIB. So I'm going to ask Sandra to demystify the terms for us. I mean, I got asked the other day about the difference between belonging and inclusion. So can you demystify those terms and help us understand so we're on a level playing field?
Try, and please chip in as well when you're doing that. I always think it's quite an interesting thing because, the whole piece about inclusion is trying not to put people in buckets, and then yet we have these terms that we're using in terms of saying diversity, inclusion, what do each of those mean? But yes, it's important, I guess, to understand. I know there's a well-known one that probably many of us heard, that you talk about, that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. I don't particularly like that myself. I have heard it because I don't get invited to parties and I can't dance unless I'm drunk. But it doesn't really tell you anything in terms of it. So it's just, it's kind of, and it is important, I think, to sort of recognise and understand it. So, diversity is, talks about that, I suppose, recognising, respecting and valuing the difference in people, because that's what it is. It's just about that we have differences and we should just value that, not find, conflict in it whatsoever. Inclusion, I guess I would see more as the behaviours and those cultural norms that make somebody feel welcome, that we would go through. And then your belonging is probably that individual sort of feeling of acceptance. It's about an individual, and you can't really have that belonging without the inclusion. They kind of go together. But the whole equity and equality bit was always the one that I was just like, how do I think about that one? And I'm a bit of a visual person, so I saw a picture recently on it, and I just thought, God, that really actually helped me be able to define it, and I'll try and very badly describe it to you all, but if you kind of imagine you're looking at a football pitch or a baseball pitch or whatever it is, and there's a fence in front of it, and you've got 3 people behind that fence. You have a tall person, a short person, and somebody in a wheelchair. And so obviously the tall person can see over the fence because they're tall. The short person is kind of struggling and might have to jump, and the person in the wheelchair is not going to, can't see that. Equality is kind of that assuming that by giving everybody the same support, so you give them all the same size box, tall person stands on that box, they can still see. Shorter person stands on that box, they can see better. The person in the wheelchair still can't see even though they're on the box. But that's equality because we've given everybody the same support. And the equity piece is kind of giving the support that's appropriate to the individual that's needed. So the person with a wheelchair gets much higher viewpoint. You give them more boxes so that they can see over the shorter person and so on. And then when you get to true inclusion, you actually take the fence away and there's no fence and everybody is truly included because you can all see the field. And that really connected me. I probably maybe didn't describe that well to you to do it, but that really kind of helped me visualize that. I don't know if you have a sort of similar way of seeing that.
The only other image, the analogy that I've seen that I really like is the different size bicycles for different size people, right? So I don't know if that was floating around Facebook a couple of weeks ago. Maybe some of you saw it, but it's it's like a child gets a bike that's this size, and a tall person with really long legs gets a bike that's bigger. So similar idea.
Yeah. Good. To help us understand a little bit more, one of the approaches that I've taken in my own organisation is to go out and talk to the networks that exist and the different communities. Having chatted to a number of the network leads in the organisation, the common message that I was getting from all of them was about the curiosity, and that links in with a lot of the themes that have come out of the conference over the last couple of days. But if you've got a question, the message that I was getting was be bold and ask your question, because if you don't ask your question, then sometimes that's worse than saying absolutely nothing. Sandra, what are your thoughts and experiences around this kind of approach?
Yeah, that really resonates with me, definitely. And I think there's 2 sides to that. Yes, ask your question, but if you're coming from a place of allyship, I think it's important to not put the onus on the individual to educate you in whatever the situation they're in. It's your responsibility. It's all our responsibility to bring inclusion to the workplace, into life, wherever it is. And I think if we're constantly asking a marginalised group or an oppressed group or disabled group or whatever it is, what do we need to do to resolve this? That's not the right way of going around it. So ask your question. Yes, if that's going to enable some change to happen, and you're coming at it from a truly ally way of doing it. And I think worse still is also just following the crowd of things and just sort of going along with everyone else without actually thinking, is this right? Or asking your own questions. Am I doing the right thing? And that, an example springs to mind with me is that I remember back in 2020, off the back of George Floyd murders and the Black Lives Movement, and there was a sharing on the internet of a black square. And I don't know if you remember, and it was just coming up on all of the feeds and things like that. And I remember sitting there going, oh, what does that mean? Do I share one? Everyone's sharing one. Shall I share one? And I literally went the whole day, right the way through to the evening, in this whole backwards and forwards. Like, I don't know what it means, but obviously I generally knew what it meant, but I thought, am I just going along with it? I didn't understand enough about it. And I think probably it's happened on a day, and I think probably 1 minute before midnight, I kind of suddenly went, oh, and I shared it, but I was just annoyed with myself that and at that point I just thought, I have got to do some reading, I've got to do some, education, I've got to ask my own questions as well. So I think while it's important to be able to be bold and go out and sort of say, what can we do to help you? It's not putting the onus on them. The onus should be on us to find the answers, I think.
And, I think it's not very British, is it, to talk about things like race and gender? It feels very uncomfortable to ask people those kind of questions because you just feel like it's inappropriate and it's rude. And that's been rooted in our culture for years and years. We don't talk about things that are uncomfortable. But it is, as you said, where you're coming from. My mum called me yesterday, actually, and she just started a new job, and she's like, all these new people at work, and I don't know how to pronounce their names. I just wish that there was a tool where they could tell me how to pronounce their names. Like, what do I say? And I was like, just ask them, of course. Like, it's a question. But she's like, oh, but am I not going to come across as awful by not knowing how to pronounce their names? And I said, they will respect you so much more by just having that, you know, minute of a meaningful interaction with someone, because it's a teachable moment, because that's what it is, and allowing them the opportunity to respond. And like you said, it's how you're asking that question. So it's not like, oh, that's a beautiful name, or that's fantastic. Like, this is my name. Okay, great. Now I know how to pronounce it and move on. It's about who's asking the question.
Absolutely.
I wonder, since the audience is you know, learning professionals, and I wonder if we can maybe draw some connections to what this would mean for a learning person in you know, who might be developing content or something like that. Because so in the research that we've been doing on DEIB and learning, the question that we've been asking is what can L&D do on to support DEIB efforts? And one of the answers that leaders give me a lot is ask for feedback, right? And it does have to be well intentioned, but I think the examples they give are things like go to an ERG, make sure that you're including ERG leaders in the design of content. Make sure that when you're doing a needs analysis that you're, you know, asking people from representative groups. But to your point about not putting the onus on them, I think then it's incumbent on the learning people to make it as easy as possible to provide that feedback and really think about what is the user experience for the people who are giving the feedback, and making it as, you know, sort of seamless and easy as possible for them to do that. Just as two examples of how you might involve, you know, do that in the learning context.
Yeah, absolutely critical part of that design and development process there. So, Sandra, I'm coming to you again. Through the learning,
have a break after this.
Yeah, you can have a break after this one. Through the learning that you've done, what insights and experiences have you gained as a passionate advocate that give us information around the different challenges that we in L&D need to address in this space?
I think one of the biggest things that came to mind when I thought about that one is definitely that leadership piece. There's a lot of people I've spoken to, or you know, different organisations where they say their leaders don't seem to be bought in to the DEI piece, and I think sort of say, yeah, you know, they're not bought in, they don't support us, they don't come along to the ERG things, they don't, you know, they don't say the things at the right time. And I thought, ask the question why don't they do that? And the likelihood is that's a fear. You've got a leader, someone that's CEO of a company, they're on the stage, they're in the spotlight, and if they say the wrong thing or don't say it quite right, or it's misinterpreted, or whatever it is, that's going to be big. That's just, you know, something. I mean, our CEO of our parent company made a kind of off the cuff remark and talked about you know, the benefits that young people bring to the business, and it was completely taken out of all proportion. Went wild on social media and LinkedIn about how he was being ageist and things like that, and one of our programs came off the back of that, which was a good thing. But you know, it just shows. So I think with leadership, it's they don't say anything for fear of saying the wrong thing. So I think in L&D, you know, we can support our leaders by making sure they go on training, give them training, because often at leadership they think that, you know, they don't need any training or learning development at the moment. So put them through a program where they can do that. We're currently doing that in Group M at the moment. Our top 100 most senior leaders are all going through a Fearless Futures program, which is like sort of 6 weekly sort of 2-hour sessions, I suppose, where they're talking about diversity inclusion from an organisational perspective and how we can remove those structural biases to help them feel more comfortable about talking about those sorts of things. I think that's one of the biggest learnings is for me is supporting leadership, because a lot of that does have to come top down and to, you know, to support that. And another great one that I learned yesterday, I was on a different conference, not one here, a top employers conference, and there was a speaker at the end called, I'll remind myself, Simon Fanshawe, and he's, I don't know if anybody's heard of Simon, but has a company called Diversity by Design, I think it is. And one of the topics when he was talking about things like that was a thing where he said, thinking doesn't change behaviour, behaviour changes thinking. And that really resonated with me, actually, when he spoke that, because actually, and then he said, you know, unconscious bias is just an excuse. And I thought, wow, you know, because we deliver unconscious bias training, and obviously, you know, get people to, within learning and development, we're trying to get people to think differently all the time, and to sort of to have a different mindset about things. But actually, how can we then try and change the behaviours? You know, more should it be the behaviours that we're looking at, and how can we support that, you know, piece around it, that it's everybody's responsibility, not just learning development, not just HR, not just the people team, and not just our leaders. It's everyone's responsibility. So ensuring that, you know, in terms of changing their behaviours, that we are calling it out, so that we're calling it in, that we're saying, you know, helping people to understand that they need to educate themselves, and you know, that it's everyone's responsibility to bring inclusion. So I think there's kind of two main pieces. But that whole bit about you know, behaviour changes thinking really did resonate with me, and I'm going to sort of take that away and do some thinking about that to see how you know, we in our organisation can start changing some behaviours. Wow.
It's interesting that you said that about sort of needing leadership and how we can support. I love this idea about how can we support leaders in you know, being more proactive, or helping them understand how they can show up differently. One of the things that I've been hearing from L&D leaders is we don't have a DEIB strategy yet, and I'm waiting for that guidance from the top. And so I think my response to that is twofold. It's a yes and, right? So it's a yes, we need to wait for some alignment, and yes, we need to help leaders be different. And there's also a ton that we can do anyway. You know, that are sort of maybe obvious right things to do, that we have control over in our, you know, within our span of control in L&D, that we can look at and think about, you know, how can we change the systems that we're responsible for in L&D to make them more equitable and inclusive. So I think for me, it's very much a yes and, rather than I'm just going to wait on leadership, right?
Yeah, and I think when it comes to leadership, there's almost a bit of a different approach you need to take when it comes to actually making a change. So whilst training programs are really impactful at getting across key messages and sharing common themes that the company want to work towards, you almost have to remember that these are really senior individuals within the organization, and you need to help them get on this journey. So what I think about a lot is that, you know, 10 years ago, businesses were so different. Like, they weren't thinking about diversity and inclusion. They weren't measured on it. It wasn't important to them. They were just focused on the business of the business. And then overnight, almost really, in 2020, that changed. And we just expected all leaders to kind of come along with us on that journey. And so what's really important to do is to recognize that most of your senior leaders won't be at that space. They'll want to be, but they're not. And the only way to help them get there is by guiding them. So I do some work outside of Amazon with Tesco, and I partner with really senior leaders, so the Chief People Officer and the CEO of F&F Fashion, and I'm their critical friend when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So every month I meet them once or twice a month, and they tell me about what's going on in their business, and I challenge them on their thoughts, thinking, and behaviors to really try and make them make the change. And it's creating that safe space to do that. So in some elements, it works for internal colleagues. So maybe I'm part of the HR or D&I team, and I can come in and meet you. But actually, it's sometimes better to have someone who's removed from your organization altogether, who doesn't care about your seniority, who doesn't care about, oh, you said this in a team meeting last week, but today you've said this. We've just got a one-on-one safe space where I am pushing you and coaching you to see things from a totally different perspective. And I know I've got great value from those conversations, and they have too, and they've made some real changes to their business. So it really is thinking about, how can I set them up with that coaching relationship rather than expecting them to go through a training program and change, because it's uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, I love that actually, and that reminds me. So if you're not familiar with reverse mentoring programs, that I've in the research that I've been doing, I've heard from a couple of leaders that like, oh, so these are L&D leaders are telling me that their senior leaders are getting a ton of value from these kinds of reverse mentoring programs, sometimes even more so than the mentee, right? And yeah, and that is something that L&D can help set up, right? Agree that sometimes it's helpful to have somebody from outside the organization, but thinking about what you might be able to do in your organizations, that kind of a program is something that you could start or build on if you already have it.
Heather, you touched on the research and the data there a couple of times. So can you tell us a little bit more about what's been done in that area and the kind of insights that we can take from that?
Yeah, so I'll start with what Red Thread has done, because our research process includes a lit review that is a review of the rest of the research that's been done. So we are, as I mentioned, doing some research on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and the going in question was, or the going in sort of assumption was, L&D functions are primarily thinking about their role in DEIB as providing more unconscious bias training, or like providing more DEIB training. And we think that there's more that L&D can do, and we want to find those things, right? Well, what are those additional things? And so our research project, we did a lit review to see what research was already out there, and the research that was already out there kind of fell into four broad categories. The first category was, and these are all categories of what is the literature saying that L&D can do, or how is the literature saying L&D can do more on DEIB? Like, what are the things they're saying? So the first part was as expected, how can we do DEIB training better, right? How can we make unconscious bias training stickier? How can we maybe follow it up with some, post-training information to help people remember it or practice it? So that whole, and I'm sure if any of you follow this, right, there have been a couple of seminal HBR articles starting from like 2016 on, does unconscious bias training work? How can we make it better, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of one category of research. The next is, okay, how can L&D functions make all training more diverse, equitable, and inclusive? So how, and this is, I feel like every time I describe this, I'm like poo-pooing everything that I describe until I get to the end, which is what we're researching. I absolutely do not intend to do that. I think all four of these elements are in fact necessary and important. So making training more inclusive and diverse and equitable is in fact really, really important. So and this is thinking about things like how is our content inclusive, right? Like, what kinds of language do we use? What kinds of visuals do we use? Are we ensuring that a deaf person could access this training equally to a hearing person? What about a blind person? So those types of accessibility, like physical accessibility issues, as well as inclusivity questions like, are we fairly representing our employee population with the visuals and the language that we use, right? So that's another broad swath of research that's been done. And there's actually a lot of really good information on that. So ATD, the Association for Talent Development in the US, or no, they're global, published a book last year called DEI for Trainers that covers a lot of that material that's actually very, very good. Then the third swath of research is around what skills do we need to develop in employees to help drive a diverse, equitable, and a DEIB culture. So these are specifically, what skills are correlated with a strong DEIB culture, and how can we plan to develop those more in employees? So it's things like envisioning a different future, dealing with ambiguity, having difficult conversations, those kinds of skills, right? That would be applicable to topics they're not specifically on DEIB, but they have a strong correlation with the culture. And there's less research on that actually, but Red Thread did some research on it last year, which is why that's not included in this particular study. So having found all of that research, what we realized is that there's a huge missing piece around what's called, the terms that I've heard that I really enjoy, that I really think are very good, are development equity or learning equity. And this is the idea of, let's look at the systems and processes of learning. So how employees find out about learning, how employees are given access to learning, like do they have the tech for it, do they have the permissions for it, that kind of thing. And then how are employees participating in learning, and how does that differ across whatever groups you have in your organization, and where might there be gaps that we need to fill? And that is a much less researched area, and so that's what we're focusing our research on.
Great. So within that research, do you want to add
I don't know. I just wanted to be.
So within that research, what's the data telling us about the cost of a culture that is not DIB?
Yeah. So it's easier to answer it if you have the positive, if you flip it on the positive and say, what are the benefits of having a culture that is DEIB? And there's actually been a lot. I think McKinsey has done some really good research on overall having a DEIB culture in the organization, and sort of the benefits of that for innovation and business, various indicators of business performance. So where we have focused our research is what are the benefits of having a learning of development equity, right? So learning that is DEIB. And what we found is that the business performance of organizations that where employees agree that so the statement in the survey is something to the effect of, to what extent do you agree that development opportunities in my organization are transparent, right? So it's easy to find development opportunities in my organization. So in high performing organizations, so we had in this massive survey that we did, we had 4 indicators of business performance. So we used that to make a business performance index. So in the businesses that were in the top 25% of that business index, those employees were more than 2 times more likely to agree with that statement about transparency than in low performing organizations. And similarly, we had a question about access, right? So I agree with it that access to development opportunities in my organization are equitable and inclusive. And they were, on that question, they were slightly over 2 times more likely to agree. So it's that kind of thing. There's a very strong correlation between business performance and learning equity, which I think is very interesting for this audience, or well, it's very interesting for my research and for this audience, I think. I hope.
We find it interesting, don't we? Yeah, thank you. And is there anything in that that gives us an indicator of what the organisations that foster a culture of DIB are doing very differently to those that don't?
Yeah, the biggest thing is they have data. Like, they're gathering data. And it's not hard data. In this particular case, like smile sheets and attendance records are actually quite useful data, right? So I think in some of the other sessions that are talking about learning impact and that kind of thing, you're looking for data that we might not have in learning, but like this data already exists, right? Who is nominated for programs, who actually participates in those programs, who has the permissions to access different e-learning courses in the organization, right? Who actually clicks on the e-learning courses. Like, this is data that we have that can be, that we can just use to track where, or, to find out where are there gaps. And I think the leading organizations are actually doing that, right? They're actually doing that analysis.
I think that's a really good point around data. A lot of discussions we have with our customers, but also in general, is that we can be very data heavy and insights poor. AWS has the most amount of data in the world, and we don't always use it in the right way. But one of the ways that we do use really well is looking at our employee sentiment when it comes to engagement and belonging. So we have a program called Connections, and so every day, all 2 million Amazonians across the world are asked a similar question every day. It's in the same content bucket. So it could be today, I think yesterday's question was, I feel included in the workplace. Or it could be, my manager gives me the feedback I need to perform. Or my manager has the visibility I need. to measure my performance. And what we do with that data is every month managers are given a PDF deck which ranks them across the entire organization of kind of where they are, some of their leading performance indicators, and some of the areas where they're not necessarily hitting. And it gives them targeted learning to help reach the benchmark that the company set. And it's great. It also gives you the opportunity to partner with other managers across the business who maybe are doing really well in a certain area where you need that coaching. And it helps everyone get there. And the great thing about these scores are that managers' own performance are measured on these scores. So, if I had really low scores within my team, then I'm not going to hit my higher end performance bonus at the end of the year. And ultimately, we know, unless you're measured financially in anything, then you're not going to do it. Like, it's great to get a certificate, it's great to get a pat on the back, but for me at least, unless there's cash involved, I don't care. And so it's really great that it's really linked to my personal performance, and it just helps create that culture of inclusion.
Yeah, we've just introduced culture platform, same sort of thing. So we're on that journey of trying to, we'll be getting that data probably in a year time, as people start to use that. But that's one of the big things that we've realised is we don't have the information to tell us how our people are feeling. We do belonging surveys regularly, sort of once a year, but unfortunately our parent organisation changed the questions each year, which is very frustrating because you then can't measure it against the previous ones. You're like, stop changing it. But you could take elements out of that. But yeah, the platforms that are available now are incredible to give you that rich source of data, definitely.
Yeah, similar in our organisation of doing that continuous listening model to be able to improve what we do. So Nathan, great, you're in the spotlight now. So how can we create a more open approach to DEIB, and what is our role within this?
It's a great question, and I think it really is that ownership model of really understanding that we're all owners in this journey. So it isn't something that a D&I team can set or a HR team. I've just had some really interesting conversations where I was thinking about moving into a solely focused D&I role within Amazon, but my leader came to me and said, actually, are you going to drive that impact in a D&I role when actually you could drive that impact even further with the right executive support in your existing role? And I really do believe that it's about how everyone comes in together to deliver on D&I. Project I did a couple of months ago with WH Smith was we got all of their exec team together at the head office in Swindon, and we sat down and we really went through the very basics of what D&I meant. So definitions, what does diversity mean, what does inclusion mean? We looked at some staff feedback, we looked at some customer feedback, and just had a really open and safe space of what does D&I mean to WH Smith, and what are some of the areas that they want to focus on. Because I think often we haven't really level set what D&I means to each organization, because it's not the same for every business, and that is okay. Like, it's fine to have set areas of focus of where you want to go towards. So like, I know certain companies that maybe have like a yearly rotation. So one year they're focusing on, increasing the number of women in certain areas, and then the next year it might be like Black representation, and that's also fine. We're not trying to create a fully diverse organization. When I say that, I mean we're not trying to have one of everybody within the organization. We're trying to have an organization that works for everyone and reflects the society that we serve. And so from a learning perspective, that's about how you can create enablement opportunities for everyone to get involved. I'm not a believer of long training courses and the 6 months of this. We don't do any of that at our team at AWS, because I just don't agree with going on these long learning journeys and expecting lots of change. It's all about those meaningful interventions of, if there's an issue, how do we create an event or a program to solve it as a partner, rather than, here's a course, see you in 6 months and hope you've changed it.
Yeah. So if there's some key things that we could be doing really, really differently, what would they be, and what would the actions need to be that we should take?
So from a learning perspective, it's really being introspective. I had a conversation this morning with probably a group of 30 learning professionals in the 30 under 30 cohort and some others, and the entire room was 100% white. There were no other ethnic representations in that room, and that's really sad, actually. And actually, if we think about it, is actually quite reflective of most HR departments and learning teams across the UK at least, we don't tend to have a really high proportion of diverse talent within these teams. And what that means is we're all creating learning within our own image. And we know that's true. Like, we all have biases, conscious and unconscious, and there's not really much you can do to disrupt them, but you can be aware of them and work to change them. And so if we've got learning teams that are not representative of the company that you work for, then of course you're not going to be creating content which is representative and it is accessible to everybody. And that's where leaning on ERGs, as you mentioned, is helpful. One of the things we do, our team at Amazon, is we've got learning boards, so people across the organization that are just interested in learning and want to contribute to the way that sessions are created, and they give advice and feedback. And sometimes it's really annoying, right? You've created something and they're like, oh, the font here is wrong and it would be great if it was in this color. And I'm like, no, I wanted this color, it's perfect like this. But the reality is that, that helps someone's accessibility, and so it's really important to try and take on all of those thoughts. It's just about bringing as many people as you can involved in the learning creation process to make those changes, because otherwise you're just creating content in a back room and it's not connected to the organization. And that's what leads L&D teams to be thought of as, just an overhead rather than an actual business plugin that's essential to the function of the business.
Yeah.
It's not just in England, but so the survey that we just did, there were 288 L&D professionals who answered it. 75% were white. So it's not. It is, and that's one data set. In the Lit review, I found at least 2 others that had very similar data. So it's a it's a Northern Hemisphere, U.S. Europe, North America Europe problem that's really, really big. And actually, so I interviewed a guy who was a black dude, and he said, I feel like the elephant in the room a lot of the time. And he really experienced this idea of he would sit back and say, no, that's not what's going to land with some people, and he was the one who often had to raise his hand and say, no, that's not going to land. That's not going to land. So being open to, just completely agree with what you just said.
That's a good question. I think as a learning function, we need to ask ourselves why, and then what can we do, to make that change.
And that is a great question, Sandra, which I'm going to throw over to Nathan around. One of the great things about these conferences and having this kind of conversation is being able to walk away with absorbing that thinking, but also walk away with some practical tips of what I can do to actually make a change and have an impact. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Nathan. What are some of the practical things that we can be doing to really improve our services and have a real impact in this space?
Absolutely. I think it really starts with understanding what the L&D team's role is in the organization. So, I mentioned previously, often L&D teams are just that overhead function that are pumping out what the business wants, but actually you can really easily turn it on its head. And what I advocate for in our team is really working with your business stakeholders to understand what it is they need, and then it's on you to help create learning in that space. So from a D&I perspective, it's challenging those stakeholders on the things that they're asking for to make sure you're being representative of the entire organization, but also your customers, because I always say that L&D teams are almost like an internal marketing team. Everything that you produce as an L&D team is the voice of the company. It's facts, like it's got the company's logo on it. And so when you put it out there, it weighs the same weight as if your CEO had sent an email with something. It's the same thing, it's exactly the same. And we have to believe we're owners in that to make those changes. I think the next step is really thinking, if you're hiring, how do I make sure that we're being really representative and bringing in as many people as we can? One of the things that I see a lot in organizations is companies hiring for cultural fit. Like, what is that? That's racism. That's what that is. Let's be real. Like, cultural fit is fitting a mold of all the people that have come before them. And all the people that have come before them have probably not really been that diverse themselves. And so again, in learning teams, we write the manager interviewing guides in some instances. We also support onboarding. Like, how do you create onboarding which actually feels representative and it meets people where they're at? Again, most onboarding sessions are just carbon copies. We never think about individual roles. We never think about individuals themselves. It's about getting back out there to the business and really wanting to go through those learning journeys and make those changes, rather than sitting, in your ivory L&D tower and pushing out all of this content. Because believe me, you'll be the first to go. As we've seen through COVID, as we've seen through recessions, when things are tough, L&D gets kicked out the door because most L&D teams don't bring that much value to the organization, if we're really honest. And the way that I've challenged my team at AWS is that everything we do needs to be linked to some kind of business metric, whether it's our directors' goals, whether it's increasing shareholder value through creating training on products and services that's relevant, or whether it's thinking about our leadership principles around diversity and inclusion and creating training which fosters and supports that. That's it. You just need to position yourself as a trusted partner to leaders. And once you've done that, you're invincible and you can navigate through your organization. That's what I've done in my career. It's how I've been able to move so quickly. I'm only 25, but I lead a large team at Amazon, the most profitable team at Amazon in terms of revenue. And I've been able to get to this position because I understand how can I make my leader feel supported, how can I give them the answers that they don't have, how can I give them a really trusted relationship where they feel safe, I can help them, and just keep climbing. I've done that in my career, and there's no reason why L&D teams themselves can't do that, because it is all about just supporting others, and that's inclusion, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Sometimes it feels a little bit like you're pushing water uphill, though, because sometimes the business doesn't know, like we've alluded to before, that the business doesn't know what its DEI objectives are, so then they can't come to ask you what training that they need support with. So you are sometimes just sort of coming up with it yourselves and pushing it out there and testing the waters. And I think that's a difficult thing to do, because you're almost telling them what they should have, and then it maybe doesn't always land so well. But to your point as well, so the value that we bring, and within my team we create an impact report every kind of half yearly, which literally sort of talks through all the different things that we've worked on with the business and partners, because we're not just all about a program and it's gone and everyone's like, oh, that's great. There's loads of little interactions that you work in L&D, and we all have different hats and we all do different things, and we're kind of a multi-purpose team. Sometimes it's not pure focus on L&D, and we forget those things, and we need to gather them and then let the business know what that value is. And we do the qualitative and the quantitative, and I can never say either of those words. So we're actually showing what the value matrix is on that now as well. So we kind of look at it. We've got quite a large internal function. I've got a team of 18 now, and we design, develop and deliver the training internally. That's e-learning as well. We've got graphic designers, sort of a real mix. And we look at what the training would be worth if we went out externally and paid for it. Obviously taking into account the overhead, salaries, that sort of thing, and then say, this is how much we've save the business by kind of doing that. So yeah, it's definitely showing that value, but in the little pockets and the areas that you would sort of forget. So it's all about recording those and making sure that you're keeping an eye on the little interactions that you might have had. You might have been working with a small team over there, who were having difficulties having conversations with clients, and you've done a small thing on having inclusive conversations, or being able to talk, or being able to be confident to kind of challenge the client on their inclusivity and that sort of thing. And it was a half a day sort of coaching conversation, facilitative bit that could have gone into the ether, but actually the business, we've probably just by empowering that small team, they've probably just brought in X amount more revenue because they've got a better relationship with the client, or they've challenged something that should have happened. So yeah, I totally agree. Really important to demonstrate that value.
Wow, what an amazing panel we've had today. So I hope that you've enjoyed that. And what we're going to be doing is we've got a lot of rich experience, a lot of practical application, a lot of data. Heather, we will be able to get access to the research.
There will be an infographic, that anyone can access. Mm-hmm.
So we'll be able to hook into that. What I'd like to do now is open up for questions. So if anybody's got, we've got a hand up straight over here and another one here.
Hi, and thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So I'm a talent and diversity and inclusion manager at my current company. And one of my roles is making sure that we have mandatory inclusion training. I hate the word mandatory, but have you got any best practice and tips on actually how I make it not a tick box exercise? Because that's how it feels right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of countries have regulatory requirements where you have to have mandatory DE&I training. So Amazon has it globally, we have the same one, and it meets all of the regulatory requirements that we have. We created one at Dyson as well, respected Dyson, and it ticks all of those boxes. One of the things I always say is that storytelling is the most meaningful form of human connection. Storytelling is the most meaningful form of human connection. And what that means is by telling stories, you are instantly connecting to that purpose and why you're doing something. So I would really recommend that when you're designing a mandatory piece of learning, yes, work with legal to make sure that you've ticked off all of the regulatory requirements, but also think about how can you tell stories of current employees, future employees, and your customers that will connect with that new joiner or that will connect with that existing employee to understand why the company is going on this journey of DE&I, because otherwise it does just feel like it's a tick box exercise and I've got to do it once a year and that's the end of it. But if you can really clearly link the value of a real human conversation of like, when this happens, I feel like this, or this has happened and now I've flourished in my career because of it, or as a customer, like seeing a representation means that I've bought from you, you can buy into that and you can really understand why you're doing something. And that's my advice. Storytelling is the most meaningful form of human connection.
Thank you. Thank you.
Come with the one here.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you again. Really, really interesting. For us, it's about how do we attract people to apply for our vacancies that will allow us to grow or replace with a diverse workforce rather than replacing in the same image. So it's great if we get the candidates, but how do we get the candidates to apply for our roles? How do we show ourselves as a diverse company or a company that welcomes diversity and inclusion?
We've worked recently with, it's kind of how you work. Do you have an internal talent team or do you use it externally? So, you know, we have the same internal talent team, but we also can work with external providers. And last year, we created a program called Digital Academy, and it was a bulk hire apprenticeship program where we brought in 75 apprentices in one go. It's the biggest piece that we've ever done. And it was how the providers that we worked with to ensure that they were bringing in, you know, that they were sourcing and working with different groups of you know, minority ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds, you know, all that variety, and that we wanted to ensure that they could demonstrate their DEI commitment and that they had the ability to bring that in, you know, to bring in that diverse group. And, you know, we were really successful in terms, and I should have had the stats here, but they were really high in terms of that broadness across the key areas that we wanted to focus on that program. And a lot of those, they came in, they joined, they started, they went through a boot camp with us, and we've still got 90% of those people in that program that we brought on. So I think it's, from my perspective, it's working with the right providers who can bring that in. But I think sometimes also, if your talent team are not diverse themselves, then they're going to go to the same places and still find the same you know, people. So I think that's a key thing, is to look to whether you can work with other providers that are able to do that for you.
Yeah, and the best piece of advice I've heard is if you can manage the politics of it, to push back and hold the job rec open until the candidate pool is as diverse as you want it to be, and sort of make that change, make that a process change, so that the ideal is that as a company, our policy is that we hold job recs open until we have such and such, representative candidate pool. If you can push that process and culture change, I think it's a very effective thing.
Hi there, thank you so much for your time and insight. I think a lot of organisations, and we've probably seen it all on LinkedIn, are working to attract more diverse talent, but their culture internally might not necessarily be inclusive. And I found that with a lot of organizations I've worked with. So what would be your top tips or best practices for talent managers, the L&D professionals in the room or watching this back to create a better culture of belonging and inclusion before you attract amazing talent and then you have your attrition actually goes up because people don't want to work there or don't feel that sense of belonging?
Do you want to take that from the research?
Yeah, yes. So this is not the research I've been doing, so I'm going to try and remember what Red Thread's research on DEIB skills was. But they identified 19 skills that differed from. So the skill differed at the senior leader, manager, and individual contributor level. And what was really interesting was that the skills that senior leaders needed were, and this is to your question of how can we drive culture change. So these are the as an L&D professional, these are the skills that we wanted to be developing in employees at various levels of the organization, right? Or that we want to be looking for when we're hiring. So for senior executives, what was very interesting is that it was not enough for them to have the skills of sort of empathy or even sort of candid conversations, right? So some of the skills that we might associate with being equitable and inclusive as a person were not enough to be a leader that can drive a diverse and equitable and inclusive culture. So the skills that were most important at the senior leader level were things like storytelling and being able to challenge the status quo and sort of drive skills that were associated with actually driving action and driving change within an organization. So you want to be developing those skills in your senior leaders. And then at the manager level, the skills were mostly associated with being able to take that vision and implement it on your teams, right? So things about, again, storytelling, actually, and then translating a vision into action, right? So it's translating a strategy into action. And then at the individual contributor level, that was where the skills of empathy and perspective taking and difficult conversations and willingness to openness to new perspectives, and really the sort of individual contributors' willingness to be role models for their peers and how they do that, right? So it was leadership those types of skills help when you are trying to lead from a position of non-authority. Yeah, so it's just sort of if you're thinking from L&D, what skills should I be developing? It's those skills at the different levels of the organization that you want to be thinking about.
The authenticity there is key, isn't it? Like, if your organization isn't at a place that you've done enough work internally, just be super honest about that. And so to as much as you can influence the external employer branding or even your training, it's really talking about, I hate this phrase, going on a journey. I've heard it 100 times the last 2 days. It's so overused. But like really thinking about you're at the very beginning of a D&I transformation, and it's not necessarily that you're going to change the business overnight or in a year, because you're probably not, but you have, as an organization, committed to doing better, and that's all that matters. And if you can really articulate that authentically from your CEO or from your directors saying, we recognize we've not done enough. We've seen that in lots of companies really recently that have either admitted to their past mistakes, they've acknowledged their links to slavery, they've acknowledged their the ability to profit from slavery in the past. The government included have been really vocal in that. And that is the first step, by saying we recognize the part we've played in creating an unequal society, and this is what we're going to do to get there. And that's all we can ask for.
I think the last 2 years have been really difficult with the pandemic in terms of the culture has sort of gone. We've all worked from home, and you sort of went into the office, and a lot of us, we made our really good friends when you're in the office. It was the buzz. You kind of joined a company because of the great stuff you got there and the people you worked with and the varieties, and just that all sort of disappeared in a instant. How do we rebuild that now in this whole hybrid piece? Because that's a whole new thing, to think about. You've got half of us not in the office anymore, half of us are, or some of us are in a meeting, some of us are at home, and I think rebuilding that culture, and it was Bruce Daisley, I think, as the ex-Twitter CEO, was saying that the reason for that this great resignation or whatever we're talking about is because someone's sitting there doing their job from home, whatever they're doing, they're just sort of thinking, I'm not feeling the company anymore. I'm not kind of getting that. I might as well just go and do the same thing at that company and earn 10 grand more. Whereas actually we were probably, retaining people through that culture and making people feel, kind of included and belonging through the culture. So I think how that's something to think about. How are we going to be able to, change that? Is that L&D's, job? Probably not, but we can contribute, to it. Yes, it's a tricky one.
Oh. Is that okay? Any more questions? One at the front.
Thank you so much. From a learning perspective, shouldn't we be talking more about privilege? I see when we talk a lot about race, we don't usually talk about like the white race and what we are doing about it and what does it mean. We don't see so much about privilege, and I don't see a lot of learning programs talking about this and making like a provocative approach about privilege in all senses. I don't know if you have seen a lot of programs that are going this direction, if these are making more results than only explaining about diversity and everything, but being more provocative about privilege.
See, they're fighting over answering.
know, right?
And do we need a little bit of discomfort for the change to happen?
Yeah. So I'm going to defer to these guys to talk about programming that might actually address privilege. The thought that I had is, so if you think about it, I'm really excited about this idea of development equity, and there is, frankly, a lot of privilege within organizations about who gets to do development and who doesn't. Right, so there's a big difference between frontline workers and non-frontline workers, or deskless workers versus desk workers, in terms of the types of development opportunities that they have. Even if deskless workers get a lot of training, sometimes it's very operational. It's very, how do you do your current job? Do it. It's not a lot of it is not very development oriented. That's just one example, right? But then if you think about hypo programs or any program that requires a nomination, there's a ton of privilege and bias and a lot of sort of reliance on informal networks that determine who gets nominated for those programs. I was talking to someone who worked for one of the major global consultancies, who said that they were running a development program, and the nominees for the program, only 9% of the nominees were women, and but the applicants for the program, or the candidate pool, was about 50-50, and managers were unconsciously not only not nominating women, they were they were putting women in remedial coaching for not meeting the criteria for the program. And so that I think is something that L&D can really take do some analysis, put a DEIB lens on how are we enabling access to programs? How are we ensuring that that different groups of people are getting, are even the way people learn about these kinds of programs can sometimes be biased or very privileged in certain ways. So if we think about those, and we think about how can we make those the opportunities for three things: discovery, access, and participation. If we look at those three things and say, are we making these equitable for all of the opportunities that we have any kind of influence over? So not just courses, but leadership programs, mentoring programs, if you have any kind of influence over job rotations or projects, stretch project assignments, those kinds of experiential learning opportunities. If we could, sorry, I feel like I'm rambling now, but if we could take a DEIB lens on all of those things, that is a huge impact that we can make.
I know we're coming up to time, but the way to disrupt privilege is really just, again, by storytelling. I'll stop talking about it, I promise. But Tesco do a reverse mentoring program where they get typically black young people, Gen Z, and they partner with senior executives across the business. It's a 6-month program, and those people are not Tesco employees. They're just random people from across the country that have applied to be part of this program. And what that does brilliantly is disrupt privilege, because you've got a senior director of a part of Tesco who has come from a very similar background to all of the other senior directors, and they're talking to a black kid on a council estate in Manchester, or an immigrant from Afghanistan in Scotland, which is a real example, and it totally changes their perception of access, and it totally changes what they need to do. And the example of the person I mentioned in Scotland, they partnered with someone in the logistics side of the business. They were working in a minimum wage job. At the end of the program, they were offered a place on Tesco's grad scheme program, like a 75 grand salary, and that would not have happened without the reverse mentoring program. So yeah, it's all about disrupting privilege.
Yeah, we've just come to the end of a sponsorship program ourselves that we put in that was for black and minority ethnic employees. They've just gone through an 18-month program, and inadvertently that sort of became a reverse mentoring as well. Although sponsorship is not mentoring because it's about active and intentional interjecting and using your power to help that person kind of find new opportunity or learn new things. It actually did become, a lot of those sponsors have learned new things from their sponsees that they would never have otherwise had their eyes open to. So, and at that senior level, that's so important.
Fabulous. So, Sandra, Heather, Nathan, I'd like to thank you for your time today. That was amazing. I'd invite the audience to give them a round of applause.